So without further ado, I will share a brief introduction. So Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change on people and the planet. She is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and endowed chair at Texas Tech University. She has received numerous awards, honorary degrees, and recognitions for her work, including being named one of the Time 100's most influential people and a United Nations Champion of the Earth. So, Dr. Hayhoe, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. It is great to be with you here today. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself before we get started. So, my doctor title is in atmospheric science. So, if anyone is having a health crisis, I can explain cloud formation to them. I am also from Ontario. In fact, I'm actually in Etobicoke right now. I am spending quite a bit of time struggling with Ontario Health at Home on behalf of my mother these days. So I have much greater knowledge of those services than I did in the past. And I am 100% convinced that climate change is a health crisis. And I also know that the data says, so there's no conviction needed on this, that health messengers and messages are extremely effective at helping people connect the dots between what this issue is and why it matters to them. So often when people talk about climate change, they talk about polar bears or ice sheets, or they talk about the future, or they talk about people who live far away. But when you talk about your kid with an asthma attack in the ER because of the wildfire smoke, that hits you right at home right away. And sadly, with climate change, we are seeing it hit home more and more every day. And so making those connections between what's happening, why it's happening, and what we can do about it is becoming even more urgent. And frankly, your community, I believe, is more important than my community in making those connections. We climate scientists can tell you that climate is changing and humans are responsible and the impacts are serious, and here's how much worse the wildfires were because of that. But you're the ones that make what I think of as the head to heart connection. So the head is all the data and facts and information, which is important. But how we make decisions as humans is the heart. And if we don't close that head to heart gap, people aren't going to understand why we need to make decisions about this issue. So I'm so glad that you invited me to speak, and I'm so glad that you have a whole organization that is thinking and talking about this. So to get started, I just want to do a few fun things. I know that we're all online, so sometimes it's a little hard to be interactive, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Let's see, here we go. Okay, and so if you have your phone, you can take your phone and you can take a picture of this QR code here, or I'm going to type this in the chat. Let's see, let me get to the chat here. I will type the link in the chat here too. polev.com/Katharine. There we go. Okay. And if you go there, so you can do it on your computer or you can do it on your phone. And with the phone, of course, you just take a picture like this. And then you should get something that looks like, my phone is a little slow right now. There we go. You should get something that looks like this. And this is a map, and what you can do is you can click there. And so the first question I had for you is just, where are you joining from? So it's okay if you're not in Ontario. That's totally fine. Just click outside Ontario in the direction that you're coming from. Looks like we have somebody joining us from Quebec. Go ahead, and if you can click, I know we're all sort of concentrated right down there in that area around the lake. But go ahead and click wherever you are joining from tonight. So it looks like we have pretty good representation across most of Southern Ontario, all the way up to Ottawa and Hull. We've got a few folks a little further out. Okay, and as I said, I myself am in Etobicoke, so West Toronto. All right. Now I have a second question. Our questions, I will warn you, our questions are going to get slightly more progressively difficult as we go along. My second question to you is, what is your medical specialty? I just want to know more about you. Here's the catch. You can only give me one word, not two words, just one word. So what is your medical specialty? All right, you already got the hang of this. Excellent. You can see why it's just one word. It's because this is a wordle, and so the more people say psychiatry, the bigger the word. So it looks like we have a pretty good variety of people. We have a couple in psychiatry. We've got family medicine, ophthalmology, hospitalist anesthesia, pediatrics, internal medicine, family medicine. Excellent. Okay. And environmentalist. That's great. Oh, gynecology. Good. Okay. All right. Now I have another question for you. And now we're going to sort of transition a little bit to what we're talking about here. My next question is, just a second here. There we go. On climate change. Oh, I'm sorry. You're not supposed to actually write it. You're supposed to do it through Poll EV. So you can answer these questions not through Zoom, but through clicking on the link pollev.com in the chat, or you can just take a picture with your phone of that QR code in the upper corner. All right. And I should say, too, if anybody's listening to the recording, I'm sorry. If you're listening to the recording, you cannot do this polling. It does not work. But you can still see the results of everybody else. But those of us who are live are answering. And so on climate change, how do you feel? We've got extremely knowledgeable, about 35%. We've got moderately informed, about 52%. We've got I know a bit, 8%. And we've got I feel like I really don't know much, 4%. Excellent. Okay, good. Well, hopefully everybody's going to sort of move up after tonight, because we will definitely get into a lot of the information about what's happening, why it matters, and what we can do about it. All right, last question. Now, for this question, you can put in, a few words or even a sentence. And this is a challenge for you, because I want to see if you can get at least 8 different ways that climate change affects our health. 8 different ways. So go ahead and write one way that climate change affects our health, and it'll pop up here. And what you can do is you can actually thumb up the ones that you agree with too. So I want to make sure we get at least 8 different ones here. So we've got respiratory, we've got heat stress, we've got drought, infectious diseases, yep. Nutritional access, yeah, food is a big one. Mental health, that is also a big one. Excellent. Okay, so let's see, let's count. So we've got respiratory is one. We've got food is another. That all kind of goes together, food, nutritional access, and all that. We've got mental health. We've got heat stress, that's 4. We've got pollution, yep, that's 5. We've got injury from extreme weather, that's 6. And we have skin cancer is caused by the destruction of the ozone hole, so we can't count that for climate change. I saw another one that I think I missed that got upvoted. Infections, yes, that's 7. Waterborne illnesses, yes, that's 8. All right, that is awesome. You passed the test. We can continue. And then what I'm going to do as I'm speaking is I'm going to go ahead and leave questions open. So as I'm speaking, now that you know how this works, at any point in the Q&A, which I'll have up in a second, you can enter a question, or you can look at people's questions and you can upvote the questions you most want us to get to, because we have lots of time to get to those at the end. So what I'm going to do from now on is I'm just going to leave, let me get there. I'm going to leave this open. And at any point, if you have a question as I'm speaking, you can go ahead and put a question in here. And I will remind you to do that as we go along. And at the end, we will get to your questions. All right, but let's get started. And I think we might need to remove that red streak, or else we're going to see that across all the slides from now on. I have 5 parts, just so you know where we're at. And the first part is, where and how did this problem begin? So if we look at human population over the last 12,000 years, you can see that there was exponential growth very recently. And a large part of that exponential growth, and this is already out of date because we're already over 8 billion people, a large reason for that exponential growth was because the average life expectancy way more than doubled. In some cases, the average life expectancy increased by 2.5 times over just over a century. A large part of that was due to the reduction in infant mortality, but then there was a whole other range of issues too. So why did human mortality, why did human lifespan increase so much? Well, we could refrigerate foods. We have lights. We have transportation. We have much more advanced medical technology than they had 100 years ago, and certainly a lot more than they had 200 years ago. And all of these advances were powered by fossil fuels. When we figured out how to dig massive amounts of coal, oil, and gas out of the ground and burn it, it powered an industrial revolution that transformed people's lives, including increasing the average human lifespan by a factor of 2 to 2.5 times. Just think about that. Think about how old you are. I'm thinking about how old I was, or I am, I should say. I mean, I would have a greater than 50% chance of not being alive right now if I had been born back before the Industrial Revolution. So our lives are much longer, they're much healthier, they're much more comfortable than they used to be, and the reason for that is fossil fuels. And then when you look around the world, you can see that we still have about 700 million people living in energy poverty, and specifically electricity, not energy, but electricity, is the most highly correlated variable with human well-being, which includes health, lifespan, and all of those other things. So if you look at this, the natural supposition that unfortunately people still say today is, if you look at the correlation between life expectancy and access to energy and electricity, don't we need more fossil fuels? Well, the answer is not so fast. And before we get to climate change, I want to tell you the other reasons why we have to say not so fast to this. So 4 reasons why fossil fuels are not the answer to our problem anymore. And I mean, it's the year 2026. And I can't believe I'm still saying this, but I am, because here in Canada, we have had 2 Liberal governments who still want to build pipelines for fossil fuels. So this is not something that people used to say back in the old days. This is still something that people are saying today. And I live in the US. And in the US, the current government is actually literally trying to turn the clock backwards. They are actively discriminating against and canceling solar and wind. They're making fun of and ridiculing batteries. They are doubling down on and investing in and even invading other countries to get access to more fossil fuels, because they are absolutely convinced that human well-being is correlated with fossil fuel use. And it is not. It is correlated with electricity, but you don't have to get electricity from fossil fuels. And increasingly, the risks of fossil fuels are getting so serious that even from the perspective of health alone, we shouldn't have been using coal for 30 years already. It just didn't add up. And nowadays, when you look at climate change and pollution and the impacts from oil and gas, they don't add up either. So why are we still using them? Because the people who benefit financially are not the people who bear the brunt of the impacts. And we will get into that as well. But before we do, here's the 4 reasons why fossil fuels are no longer the answer to our problems. Reason number 1, do you remember that map I showed you of where people live in energy poverty? What continent do most of the people live in who are in energy poverty? If you remember, most of the people in energy poverty live in Africa. How much of the world's fossil fuels does Africa have? Not much. So what are we saying? Oh, poor countries, buy our fossil fuels to industrialize yourselves and then buy more fossil fuels from us for the rest of your life? How does that actually help them? The second reason is extraction. Extraction is very dirty. Extraction, whether it's mountaintop coal removal or whether it's fracking, pollutes water, pollutes air, and leads to a host of problems. Kidney issues, heart disease, birth defects, cancers, and more. In fact, the health implications of oil extraction in the Niger Delta are so severe that there is an entire Wikipedia page devoted only to this one issue. That is how bad they are. And it's not just there. If you look around the world, you see that countries that you wouldn't expect are getting fossil fuels from places that involve human rights violations, massive health impacts on local people. And then this is really ironic. Look at this over here on the right, Venezuela. Look at when it was written, 2018. And it explains a really interesting connection between health care and fossil fuels. When the oil price began to fall in 2008, the largest oil reserves in the world could not, in Venezuela, could not stave off economic collapse. Price controls led to rocketing inflation and falling GDP for Venezuela, and the impact on the healthcare system was exacerbated by all this, leading to a shortage of the foreign currency they needed to import equipment, food, and medicines. So because this entire economic system depended on fossil fuels, when fossil fuel prices tanked, their whole healthcare system did too. Then there's the combustion of fossil fuels. Whoops, there we go. Burning fossil fuels produces massive amounts of air pollution. And air pollution is nothing new. In fact, the very first air pollution legislation in the entire world was put in place by whom? By King Edward in the 1300s. Yes, in the 1300s, the air pollution from burning sea coal over London was so severe that he said that when the Queen was in residence, nobody was allowed to burn sea coal within the city limits of London on pain of death. I imagine that was pretty effective. Since then, though, it's just gotten worse. So a study 10 years ago found that air pollution kills more than 5 million people around the world every year. And then epidemiologists were like, oh, wait, no, it's actually more than that. Then they were like, okay, I think it actually kills about 8.8 million extra people around the world. And then they were like, no, it's actually 10 million people around the world. And that's just the air pollution. We also have the dirty water. We have the pollution of soil. All told, pollution itself is linked to 1 in 6 deaths. And not all, but the majority of pollution, especially air pollution, comes from the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. Of course, there's also pesticides and fertilizers and plastic pollution and all kinds of other things too. But if you want to take a big chunk out of the pollution pie, so to speak, your biggest bang for your buck is fossil fuels. And this pollution I alluded to earlier, these issues and pollution specifically, they're not equitable. The people who live in the homes next to big highways, the people who live next to big industrial areas because they can't afford to live somewhere else, they're the ones who are disproportionately exposed to and often have less access to the healthcare and the health information they need. So far, we haven't even gotten to climate change, but now number 4 is climate change. When you burn fossil fuels, they don't just produce air pollutants that you can see and that you breathe in, but they also produce heat-trapping gases. And these heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm 10 times faster than the fastest warming period we've ever seen in the last 100 million years. Let me say that again. In the last 100 million years, the fastest warming we've ever seen was 10 times slower than the warming we're seeing today. That is why it is no exaggeration to say we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home we have. Now, I spend a lot of time on social media, and the reason why I do it is not because I'm some type of masochist, but because that's one of the ways that we can actually share information with people. And as you will see as I go through this, we have a huge lack of information, not just about what's happening, but about why it matters and what we can do about it. So I post on Facebook and LinkedIn and Threads and Instagram. I enjoy Blue Sky, I will admit, I do enjoy that. But in a lot of the other places when I post, I get people saying, oh, but it's been warmer before, so why does this matter? And really, the more we know about the history of our planet, the more worried we are, because when you look back more than 100 million years, you can see that there have been periods of change as fast as we're seeing today. There have been, to be very precise, there have been 5 of those. And those 5 periods of change that were as fast as today or faster were known as extinctions. So it's not good news when you look to the past. In fact, the more you look at the past, the worse the news is today. And the more we need to take what we're doing very seriously before we lead to the 6th extinction. A number of years ago, 10 years ago exactly, I was invited to go up to Churchill with Polar Bears International, who study the polar bears. They have tagged almost all the polar bears in the world, and they follow them in their journey out on the ice and across the ocean, and they weigh them, and they measure them, and they track them to see how climate change is affecting polar bears. So I won't really want to go, but I study how climate change affects people. And so I remember I had breakfast with the chief scientist for Polar Bears International. I said, of course I would love to go with you to see the polar bears. But you have to understand, I study how climate change affects our health and our food and our water and our infrastructure and things like that. And he said something I would never forget. He said, the reason we study the polar bears is because after the polar bears, we're next. So when we think about extinctions, we typically don't think about the human race. But, and we're not talking about humans going extinct this century. It's not like it's going to happen in 10 years or 100 years. But if we don't change the course we're on, we are putting our society and our civilization at risk. Our entire civilization is built for conditions of the past. The food we eat, the water we drink, where our cities are built, it's all built for the conditions for the past. And the faster things change, the more at risk we are. So let me go back to sharing here. So it's no exaggeration to say we're conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home we have. And that takes us to part 2, which is, how does climate change affect us? And that is what I've already been mentioning a little bit, but let's go through this in detail because this is really important to understand. So I mentioned how when we burn coal and gas and oil, it produces these heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, essentially wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. Why do I say extra? Because our planet already has a natural blanket of naturally occurring heat-trapping gases that keeps us at the perfect temperature for life. In fact, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice if we didn't have this natural blanket. But just like too much of something natural is bad for you, too much water, we drown. Too much medicine, we could actually die. Too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it doesn't need. As a result of that extra blanket, the planet is warming. And it's warmed so far by almost 1.4 degrees Celsius. And that's why we refer to this as global warming, because we scientists track the average temperature of the planet, measured by thousands of thermometers all around the world. We carefully average it up, and we can see that from year to year it goes up and down. But decade by decade by decade, it goes up and up and up. Now, here's another objection I often hear on Facebook. 1.4 degrees, that's nothing. I mean, if I just go from, inside to outside right now, I've got a temperature difference of what, like 30 degrees easily. So why would that be a big deal? Well, what they don't understand, and what you understand, is that it's not the absolute value, it's the variability that matters. So what's the average temperature of the human body? 37.6 or something around there. I run a little low myself. So that's pretty warm. But if we're running a 1.5 degree fever, we feel sick. We feel achy, taking some Tylenol. You're getting some calls from some people wondering who breathed on us or what we ate, wishing we'd worn a mask. So over the course of human civilization on the earth, our average temperature has been as stable as that of the human body. Our body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree over the course of a day, and that's normal and natural. The average temperature of the planet has gone up and down by a few tenths of a degree over the entire course of human civilization, which of course is not that long, 6,000 to 8,000 years. And now, all of a sudden, after going up and down like this, it's gone like this. We're running a fever. So it's really amazing to me how the analogy of the human body is almost a perfect analogy for why this 1.5, or sorry, we're at 1.4 right now, this 1.4 degree warming of the planet matters. But this is what scientists measure. But for the average person, they're like, it's cold outside. Where's global warming now? And by the average person, of course, I do mean the President of the United States, as well as maybe your neighbor and a few other people. So that's why, rather than referring to this as global warming, I often call it global weirding. Because wherever you live, the weather is getting weirder. And in fact, warming temperatures are even increasing lake effect snow, for example. So what is global weirding? It's the idea that wherever you live, anywhere on Earth, it's like you have this pair of weather dice, and you always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. What's a double six? It could be a storm or a flood or a heat wave or a drought or some type of extreme weather. As climate changes, it's sneaking in and it's taking another one of these numbers and turning it into a 6. And then another 6, and then even a 7. And so all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, what was that wildfire season we had 3 years ago? We've never had one like that as long as we've been alive. And oh gosh, we just had another one last year. How could that happen? It's because we now have a couple of 7s on our dice. Sure, you can still roll a 1 or a 2, but the risk of rolling these extremes is increasing decade by decade. So our heat waves, they're coming earlier in the year, they're lasting longer, they're staying late in the year, and they're more intense. Our wildfires, the wildfire season is starting much earlier in the year, started in February last year. And the wildfires are burning much greater area because it's hotter and it's drier. What about droughts? Droughts are naturally occurring, but once a drought settles in, it's more intense and longer and drier than it would have been otherwise. What about hurricanes? They get their energy from warm ocean water. And I mentioned this blanket we're wrapping around the Earth. It's trapping all this extra heat inside the blanket, just like a blanket traps your body heat on a cold night. What percent of that heat is going into the atmosphere that we're tracking with our thermometers? 1%. Where's most of the rest of it going? Into the ocean. 90% of it is going into the ocean. The rest of it's going into the ice, the cryosphere, and into the land surface. So 90% of this heat's going into the ocean, and what it's doing in the ocean is it's powering stronger storms. So hurricanes are not more frequent because the dynamics that cause them to form don't actually depend on temperature. But once they're formed, they're plugged into a much warmer ocean. It's like if you've ever taken a hairdryer to Europe. I don't know if anybody's ever done that and plugged it into the wall. I did it once. You only ever do it once. My hair was dried in about 2 seconds flat, and then the hairdryer exploded. Why? Because it was getting a lot more energy over in the UK than it would here in Canada. In the same way, our hurricanes are getting a lot more energy. So they're spinning up faster. They're sweeping up more rain. They're staying stronger longer. And by the time those hurricanes get up to the Maritimes, they're a lot stronger than they would have been 20, 30, 50 years ago. Then there's atmospheric rivers that hit BC and California. They're getting stronger too, and they're dumping a lot more rain. And plain old heavy rainfall is also increasing because warmer air holds more water vapor. And when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And of course, that contributes to all kinds of waterborne illnesses. So according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the cost of extreme weather disasters has been increasing exponentially, not linearly. In the 90s and 2000s, it was about $500 million a year, accounting, of course, for how the value of the dollar has changed over time. By the 2010s, it was at $1.5 billion per year, not including the Fort McMurray wildfires. By the 2020s, we're already above $2 billion a year. And let me show it to you like this. This is what it looks like. So these are the last 4 decades up to the end of 2024, and we haven't got the numbers for 2025 yet. So what does this mean? Oh, I forgot that these were the really bad ones in 2024. So the Jasper wildfire Calgary hailstorm, the terrible flooding we had in the GTA, the remains of Hurricane Debbie that hit Quebec. So back in the 1980s and 90s, we had one insured catastrophic event every 3 months. And now we have one every 4 weeks. That sounds bad, but believe me, it's worse south of the border. So south of the border in the US, there was $1 billion climate and weather disaster every 4 months in the 1980s, same as us, right? By the 2000s, by the 2010s, there was one every 2.8 weeks. Remember, we're at one every 4 weeks? And last year in the US, there was one every 10 days. So when we see these headlines, wildfire season starting early, temperature records being broken, we can now put numbers on how much worse climate change is making it. We can put numbers on how much more frequent a heat wave is, how much more likely a flood was. We can even put numbers on how much more area was burned by wildfires, and we can track it. We can track 38% of that area to the emissions of 88 companies. That is what climate science can do. And all of these changes, of course, they're affecting our food, not just the amount and availability, but of course, even the nutritional quality of our food is changing. With more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants grow faster, but that decreases the nutritional content of the fruits and the vegetables. It's affecting our water, the quantity and the availability. It's affecting the infrastructure that we've built. It's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is quite literally about saving us. And that's a really important shift, because so often people are like, okay, people or the planet, the environment or the economy. And this was actually an argument that, I don't know if you remember back, during the Harper administration. This argument was used a lot. It was like, oh, well, we would like to do something for the environment, but the economy, we have to prioritize the economy. And honestly, I think we might be hearing a bit of that right now too. But the reality is there is no economy on a dead planet. And sure, you might look at quarterly returns and make decisions for quarterly returns that look different. But if you're interested in a livable planet for yourself over your lifespan, let alone your children or your grandchildren, then you have to understand that the economy and the environment, people and the planet are the same thing. It's not about saving the planet. It is quite literally about saving us. And that mindset is very important shift, because then you're not deciding between, oh, it'd be nice to, I know David Suzuki would like us to do this. As they say in Texas, bless his heart. That sort of means like, I know the person means well, but they can go do it and I'm not gonna. So you could say, I know that David Suzuki wants us to do this, but we have to be hard-nosed about this. The housing crisis, the grocery crisis. Well, guess what? The housing crisis, the grocery crisis, and every other crisis is just going to get worse if we don't fix this. So that's a really important paradigm shift that we often don't think about. And going back to where I was, let's see. Going on to part 3, why is it a health crisis? Okay, so let me just stop here because we don't have that many of us, and I know that there's a couple of questions in the chat. I know you've been putting questions in Poll EV, which is awesome, but do you have any clarifying questions? I am going to talk about how climate change affects health. I'm going to talk about what the solutions are to climate change, and then I'm going to talk about what the social science says that we should be doing to catalyze solutions. So I'm going there. But before I do, are there any clarifying questions? If you have any clarifying questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. Something that didn't make sense to you that you just wanted to sort out before I move on. I'm covering a lot of material, so I don't want to leave you hanging. Any clarifications? Not seeing anything. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Okay. If nobody has any questions, I will keep on going. Let's go back to the screen share. And don't forget, as I'm talking, you can put your questions at any time in Poll EV, and we will talk about those at the end. All right. Part 3. Why is climate change a health crisis? Well, honestly, by this point, you're probably saying, well, why is it not a health crisis? Like, what part of it is not a health crisis? And you'd be absolutely right. I mentioned earlier there's at least 8 ways that climate change affects our health. I think we got one more in the previous list because there's one I have on this list that you didn't have, but we counted 8 last time. So, first of all, the most obvious one is the increasing risk of heat-related illness and death. A study came out this past year estimating some astronomical number of heat-related deaths over the past 10 years could be directly attributed to a warming planet. The challenge, of course, with epidemiology is they don't write this on the death certificate. So you have to do the background population studies to look at when the heat spikes, how do the mortality rates change to really pull that number out. But we're starting to realize it is way bigger than we thought it was. Then a lot of you mentioned respiratory. So yes, climate change exacerbates air pollution and allergens in multiple ways. First of all, the chemical reactions in the atmosphere that turn tailpipe emissions into ground level ozone speed up when it's warmer. So the warmer it is, the worse our urban air pollution gets because the chemical reactions are happening faster. That's one. Then, of course, we have the wildfire smoke. Even at the height of COVID, there were some weeks across the western US where the number of deaths from wildfire smoke exceeded the number of deaths from COVID. And of course, you put COVID on top of wildfire smoke and you have an exacerbated crisis. And then climate change is also changing allergens. More CO2 in the atmosphere is disproportionately affecting weeds like ragweed. They're growing faster and they're producing more pollen than they used to. And that's affecting the people's ability to breathe as well if they have respiratory allergies. Then, you got this one too, it's making weather disasters more frequent and more severe. Now, when these disasters happen, there's the direct impact, right? There's the person who, gets an infection, the person who suffers an injury, the person who actually loses their life. But we're realizing that the indirect effects of extreme events are at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude, greater than the direct impacts. So the mold in the homes, the loss of community, network and healthcare support, and all kinds of things that add up afterwards, making the tail of the mortality and the health risks from these extreme weather events enormous, lasting for years. We mentioned the fact that there's water contamination and disease. Extreme rainfall increases the risk of flooding, washing contaminants into water supply, and then people are exposed to them. We've also got the spread of vector-borne disease. You know, they used to have dengue in Chicago and it was eradicated. They used to have malaria in Chicago and it was eradicated. And it's likely it's going to come back because of the way that the vectors that carry these different diseases are spreading. We also see that Lyme disease has spread into Canada. So Lyme disease you get from a tick. And it's really interesting because my husband grew up in rural Virginia and he grew up out in the country. And whenever he would come in as a child from spending the day in the woods, his mother would strip him and search him for ticks because they took ticks very seriously. Now, I grew up here in Ontario and I did run through the woods every day in the summer. I never got searched for a tick in my life because we didn't have ticks, right? So fast forward to 15 years ago, I was working with a student and a professor at U of T who were studying kudzu. And kudzu is an invasive Japanese vine that was brought in during the Depression for farmers to plant in the American South to feed their cattle. And it turned into the vine that ate the South because it had no natural predators and it just basically took over the entire South. And they spend $1 billion every year just ripping it off essential infrastructure. So our graduate student was studying and taking samples of kudzu. And as she was out in the field taking samples of kudzu, she didn't realize she was being exposed to ticks. And she got bitten and she got Lyme disease. She also discovered that kudzu had already made it into Canada. In fact, it was in Leamington. but it was on private property, and kudzu was not yet listed as an invasive species by Natural Resources Canada because no one thought we would ever get kudzu in Canada. Because you have to have a couple of winters in a row where it doesn't go below -4. And everybody was like, oh, that's never going to happen. Well, it did. So she discovered we already had kudzu over the border, and she got Lyme disease from her exposure in the States. But it took forever to diagnose it here in Ontario because our doctors weren't used to Lyme disease. Fast forward 10 years, who doesn't know somebody who has Lyme disease? It is all over. It's all over Minnesota. It's all over Wisconsin. We've got it here in Ontario as well. And that's a vector-borne disease that's exacerbated by changing climate. All right. Enough of that soapbox. On to the next one. Impacts on our mental health. Yes. Oh my goodness. Mental health crises are increasing, especially among younger people who feel helpless and hopeless and do not know what to do about climate change. This one absolutely breaks my heart. In fact, I teach students. I'm teaching a class right now of undergraduates, and I ask them how worried they are about climate change. And this is in West Texas, right? This is in like the most conservative part of the US. Every single one of my students is at least rating themselves as 8 out of 10 worried. Some are 10 out of 10. Some are even saying they were afraid to take the class because they're so worried. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Saving Us, which is about what we can do about climate change. And I've heard some really amazing stories of people who read Saving Us, but one of the ones that really broke my heart was I heard from a young woman who was a student who was so paralyzed by climate anxiety that she dropped out of school and couldn't even leave her home. Somehow, somebody gave her a copy of my book, and somehow she got the bravery and the courage required to read it. Because if you're paralyzed with fear and anxiety, why would you want to read anything about what you're afraid of? I wouldn't. But somehow she managed to read my book, realized that the message of the book was about what you can do about it rather than what you need to be worried about. And that was what started her on the path to recovery. And the saddest thing in the world is that her father is one of our premier climate scientists in Canada. So mental health is a huge challenge that disempowers people. It causes them to despair and give up. Then, we're not done yet, we've got the nutritional aspect that I mentioned earlier, how not only are we losing billions of dollars worth of crops every year due to shifting rainfall patterns, stronger droughts, changing temperature and storms, but we're also seeing decreases in the nutritional content of the food, which matters especially to many of the poorest parts of the world. Number 8 is the one you didn't mention. And if I were asked which of these would have the biggest overall impact on humans in general, not necessarily in Canada, but in the world, it would be number 8. What do you think number 8 is? Interesting, eh? So on the surface, this doesn't look like a health crisis, right? But first of all, when there's conflict, like the horrible conflict in Ukraine that's been going on for longer than any of us ever imagined, there's massive loss of life, there's massive suffering. And when there is conflict, and this is happening in places like Iran right now, it's happening in Venezuela as we saw, what's the first thing to go? Basic health services and basic education are some of the first things to go. And so all of a sudden having a baby becomes a life-threatening issue. Just feeding your children becomes an impossibility. Stepping on a rusty nail, that's the end. All of the things that we take for granted in modern life fall away from us as conflict and risk expose us. And unfortunately, that's being exacerbated by climate change too. So I've alluded to this already, but I want to be really clear. Too many people who totally accept that climate is changing and humans are responsible and the impacts are serious and we really should do something about it, still think of climate change as one more bucket to fill. And not only is this an incorrect perspective, it actually leads to the completely incorrect approach and attitude and perspective towards this issue. Because the reality is climate change is an everything issue. So if you care about infrastructure or the economy or energy, you care about climate change because it's actively affecting these things. And I have worked with infrastructure engineers, I have worked with economists, and I have even worked with energy companies here in Ontario who are worried about how climate change is affecting the surge in energy demand. If you care about water or food or health, climate change affects it, as we've just seen. If you care about natural resources or biodiversity or conservation, if you care about education or even equity, racial equity, gender equity, almost any type of equity, climate change makes those things worse. So climate change is not a separate bucket. Like we might think we have, early childhood education and maternal health and mental health. And we might think we have this list of buckets, then we've got climate change at the end, and I really don't have time to get to that bucket because there's too many other things, right? Wrong. Climate change is not a bucket. Climate change is the whole in every other bucket. Whatever it is that you care about, climate change is making it worse. And if we don't fix this issue, we can't fix anything else because the hole in each bucket is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which means you're having to pour more resources, more time, more effort just to keep the water level. And pretty soon we won't be able to catch up. We will not be able to maintain our provincial healthcare system. We will not be able to maintain our resources, our education, our infrastructure, even at the current level, if we don't fix climate change because we don't have enough money and resources to do it. That's why climate change matters. So the corollary to this is actually pretty cool. It's that to care about climate change, you do not have to be David Suzuki. You don't have to be Elizabeth May. You don't have to be Catherine McKenna. You just have to be somebody who lives on Earth. And all of us still are. There's a few people who, if they really want to go to Mars, they're welcome to. But the rest of us, we're here. This is our home. And that means that we're the perfect person to care about this issue. Now, I've been speaking generally about how it affects us all, but I do want to point out in detail something I've mentioned before, which is it doesn't affect us equally. If you look around the world at who's most vulnerable, you can see that who's most vulnerable tracks pretty linearly with socioeconomic resources in that country. You can look at the percentage of people in poverty. You can look at the places where people still experience hunger. You can look at the places where people die from access to unsafe water, lack of sanitation. And you can see that globally, those who have the least are most affected, but they've done the least to cause the problem. And then within individual populations even, we see women are affected more than men, especially by extreme weather disasters. Indigenous people tend to be affected more than their colonizers, especially in the US, but also here in Canada. People of color tend to be more impacted because they live in neighborhoods more prone to flooding or heat. When we look across countries, we see the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries has already increased by 25%, thanks to climate change. And just before COVID, the United Nations announced that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of what? Of development, global health, and poverty reduction. That's why this is a health crisis. We cannot address development, global health, and poverty reduction if we don't patch the hole in the bucket. So when we look at these impacts around the world, we see similar risks here in North America, but the impacts are orders of magnitude greater in places like Bangladesh, Haiti, Syria, and the island of Dominica. Oh, that was Siri. I said Syria, and my phone thought that was Siri. And the island of Dominica, which was completely devastated by the hurricane season a number of years ago. And when the Prime Minister went to speak at the United Nations, he said to deny climate change is to deny the truth that we have just lived. So this is already happening. It's not in the future. It's happening today. It's happening now. And it's affecting all of us. And that's why we need solutions. All right. Before I get to solutions and what we can do, any other clarification questions? More in-depth questions, save them for PolyV. You've got the link for PolyV there. But anything that didn't make sense or anything that you just want me to clarify? Not seeing anything. We have lots of times for questions at the end. We have about 10 more minutes of me talking, and then that's just questions. Okay, let us continue then. What do solutions look like? First of all, when it comes to solutions, I want to be very clear. There is no silver bullet. If I had $1 for every time I have seen a news headline saying, "Is this the silver bullet?" I could at least buy myself a decent meal. There is no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot, and that's good news. In fact, we have all the silver buckshot we need. What does it look like? To explain climate solutions, I like to use the image of a pool, like the pool that I grew up with in my backyard here in Etobicoke, above ground pool. Think of the pool as the atmosphere. The level of water in the pool is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And remember, I said we already have a natural blanket. So we already had just the right amount of water in the pool that our toes could just touch the ground. And then, back at the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a giant hose in the pool. And we've been turning the hose up every year. So the level of water in the pool is not only rising, it's rising faster and faster every year. So what do we have to do? There's 3 things we need to do, and those 3 things are the 3 categories of climate solutions that we have. Solution number 1, it's the obvious one, right? Turn off the hose. We need to turn off the hose. But our pool has a drain. And by making the drain bigger, we can actually take more water out of the pool. There's a 3rd thing we have to do. For many people, the water in the pool is so high, their toes don't touch the ground anymore. We also have to learn how to swim and teach other people how to swim. That's resilience and adaptation. The faster we turn off the hose, the bigger the drain gets, the less we'll have to learn how to swim. But unfortunately, we're already at the point where most of us do have to do a bit of swimming. So what do these look like in detail? Let's drill down. Turning off the hose. What's the number 1 way to turn off the hose? It's actually not clean energy, it's efficiency. We are quite wasteful with our energy. We waste more than 50% of the energy we produce. And actually about 1/3 of fossil fuel energy is just used to extract, refine, and transport fossil fuels. So efficiency is a really, really affordable and effective way to start cutting our emissions. And then once we've made everything efficient, then we want to replace everything with clean energy. We also want to improve our land use and agriculture because 75% of these heat trapping gases come from fossil fuels, but 25% come from agriculture, primarily animal agriculture and fertilizers, and cutting down trees. We also have behavioral change. And then for the last few drops in the hose, we have very expensive ways to literally cut a slit in the hose and suck a few drops out of the hose and bury it underground. And that's called carbon capture and storage. There's this really phenomenal resource. If you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend it. It's called Project Drawdown. And it's drawdown.org, if you want to put that in the chat for people to click on. And what they've done is they've collected all the different climate solutions and they have them categorized so you can look at them by category. So I just took a quick picture of the energy efficiency category. And as you can see, I got from E down to S. There's a lot more. And it's got everything from smart thermostats and insulation to efficient ocean shipping to retrofitting buildings. Then we've got clean energy. I live in Texas where 38% of the electricity on the grid is already wind and solar, which is pretty cool for Texas. Electric heat pumps people are starting to put in so that you can electrify your home rather than using gas for your furnace. And there's all kinds of other ways to decarbonize our industrial practices. I work with the Nature Conservancy, not the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The Nature Conservancy globally is called Nature United in Canada. And if you think that's confusing, believe me, it is. I work with the Nature Conservancy around the world and Nature United in Canada. And we do a lot of work looking at how we can address deforestation, how we can reduce agricultural emissions, how we can integrate conservation and biodiversity protection into our land management to reduce our emissions. Then we get to the drain. And you might say, okay, sure, plant trees, right? Yes, but that's not number 1 either. The first thing we need to do is to protect the ecosystems we already have, Old growth forests, like we have on the West Coast, sequester massive amounts of carbon, massive amounts. We would be planting pine trees for decades to try to keep up with the carbon that they already have and take up every year. So protect what we have is first, restore the ecosystems that have become degraded, coastal wetlands, marshes, peat bogs, grasslands, and forests too. Then, if we've completely destroyed them already, then you replant them. That's the regenerating, the tree planting. Climate smart agriculture. You know what's so interesting? In the United States, the top solution with the most potential to take carbon out of the atmosphere is actually planting trees because they've cut down so many of their forests in the United States. Globally, it's protecting ecosystems. In the US, it's regenerating ecosystems. You know what the number one solution here is for Canada? It's number 4. That is our number one solution. The most carbon that we can get out of the atmosphere through any of these nature-based solutions is number 4. And so it's really cool. Nature United is working with a lot of farmers. They're working actually with RBC. They're working with a lot of different folks in industry to try to make sure that we can figure out how to incentivize farmers to practice regenerative agricultural practices, to take carbon out of the atmosphere as well as improve soil health, improve ecosystem health, and improve our health too. Okay, down at the end, for the last few drops down the drain at great expense, we can develop these super duper fans that you blow air through and they suck carbon out of the atmosphere and we bury it deep underground. That sounds wonderful, right? It is, but it's very expensive. And the top guys in the world who do this in Switzerland, I've met with them, I talk with them, and they're great. They're called Climeworks. They estimate that if everybody in the world did everything they could to invest in direct air capture, that could be, by 2050, as much as 5% of the solution, if everybody invested everything they could. So you can see there is no silver bullet. We need it all. The last few drops will matter, but let's do all of these other things first. So we do a lot of really innovative things. We work with conservation measures and financial mechanisms like blue bonds and green bonds, where we take a country like Belize that has massive debt and massive biodiversity, and we find an organization to refinance their national debt at a much lower interest rate if they agree to use the money they've saved for climate mitigation and biodiversity protection, and the Nature Conservancy agrees to serve as a guarantor and a monitor of those actions. So those are the types of ways that we're really trying to leverage solutions around the world. If you go to Project Drawdown, oh my gosh, they've got so much of Project Drawdown. Look at all of these solutions that promote climate smart agriculture and restore ecosystems. Everything from investing in Indigenous people's tenure of their own land to reducing food waste. We waste so much food. About half the food that we produce in Canada is wasted. To silvopasture and more. Then there's one more thing I talked about. Remember, turn off the hose, make the drain bigger, and learn how to swim. That is adaptation. And we can adapt in a lot of different ways. We can adapt our infrastructure. We can use technology to help us adapt. We can use nature to help us adapt. And we can even alter our behavior to become more adapted. So for many years, I was part of something called the Infrastructure Climate Network, where we were actually looking at how to make infrastructure more resilient to extreme heat and flood. And these are the type of pictures that our members would come with every time we had a meeting. They'd be like, oh, you would not believe the pictures I found this time of all the ways that infrastructure was getting destroyed. We can use technology to make us safer. Early warning systems, citizen science, digital technology for resilience. But I get really excited about the solutions with nature. I love the fact that you can use nature to protect our coastline infrastructure from storms. You can use nature to reduce the urban heat island effect by as much as 4 to 5 degrees Celsius during heat waves. You can use nature to reduce flood risk in all kinds of ways. And in fact, the Nature Conservancy in Louisville, Kentucky, just conducted the first clinical trial of nature with the medical school at the University of Louisville. Let me explain. So the Green Heart Project, people living in low-income neighborhoods typically have much poorer health outcomes, in part because they do not have green space, the air pollution levels are higher, and the heat levels are higher. So what the Nature Conservancy did was we partnered with a community to help them green their community. And you can see a before and after picture here below. And then the university measured the levels of inflammation before and after, as well as levels of inflammation in neighborhood areas that were not greened. And within a single year of greening the neighborhood, they found that those who lived in the intervention area had a 13 to 20% lower levels of inflammation. And the only thing that changed was nature. That just gives me chills. This is a zoom in of the before and after, one of the before and after pictures. So there's so much data on nature. And I know nature is medicine is a whole different topic. That's not my area of expertise that you're probably going to get somebody to talk about in the future. You might already have. It's absolutely fascinating. One of my colleagues is a medical doctor, Dr. Bill Frist. Used to be a senator in the US, and now he chairs the Nature Conservancy Board, and he is I think he did one of the first lung transplants in the world back in the day, and he is all in on this. And so he shared this slide with me, comparing your brain activity after walking in the forest for an hour versus shopping for an hour. And you have before the walk and you have after the walk. And the gray is walking in the city and the green is walking in the forest. Isn't that interesting? So there's all kinds of things that they've measured. Cortisol levels, mental health ability, all kinds of things have tracked with that. And you can use nature for so many other things. You can use nature to protect coastlines. You can use nature to protect from drought. And the best part about it is these solutions, they save us money. An Oxford study 2 years ago showed that decarbonizing the energy system would save at least $12 trillion by 2050, and the faster we did it, the more money we'd save. So why isn't everybody running to decarbonize our energy system? It's because the $12 trillion wouldn't be made by the fossil fuel companies. And so there's every reason to keep the current hierarchy of power and status quo, because those making the money today wouldn't be the ones making the money tomorrow. Nature is valued at $7 trillion. And that's in an economy where we only value nature if it's dead. What if we actually valued nature if it's alive? There's a really cool new documentary coming out with Benedict Cumberbatch as the narrator. I forget what it's called, but just look for him. And it talks about how we value nature, and it's actually very good. I watched it recently. It's made by the same guy who does the Sir David Attenborough series, which, to be totally frank, after the episode where the walruses fell off the cliff to their death, I couldn't watch it anymore. I don't know if you watched that episode, but it's just this horrible, yeah, you're nodding, Max. This is a horrible episode of this cliff and these walruses just plummeting off to their death. I gave up on Sir David after that. I mean, more power to him. I mean, he's running around at age 96 producing a new documentary every other day. But I was like, that is not going to make me feel better about the situation. It is not going to encourage my climate action. So anyways, this is in October. I was at a dinner where we saw a preview of this new movie with Benedict Cumberbatch. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's so good. And the director got up and he talked about the social science of how to catalyze change, how we have to show people not just what's happening, we have to show them why it matters, and we have to talk about the hands, what we can do about it, and how if you just show doom-filled news, it actually disempowers people and leads to further mental health crises. So he gave this whole speech on a social and behavioral science perspective on catalyzing change through documentaries. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. And so I was sitting beside him at dinner, and I'm like, I just loved what you had to say. And he's like, oh yeah, he's like, I've been learning so much about social and behavioral science and what a difference it can make. And I'm like, this is so refreshing. I said, typically you just get these documentaries of these walruses falling off cliffs that just make you want to cut your throat and give up. And then he got this kind of funny look on his face. And he was like, I'm the producer for Sir David Attenborough. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. And he said, I've learned a lot since then. And I was like, oh yes, obviously you have. Anyways, So if you do see that movie, I highly recommend it. Don't go back to the walruses, but watch the movie that's coming out about the value of nature. I think it's coming out probably in April, maybe. It's very good, and it really explains what this is all about. All right. But the bottom line really is solutions for climate and for nature are not just like for the planet and not people, or the environment and not the economy. They're solutions for us too. They're economic solutions. They're solutions that protect us, that improve our health. They're solutions that give us energy that's more affordable, not less, that reduce inequality, that create more resilient food systems and water systems. They're solutions for a better future. And the physical science agrees. This is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says. It says, our choices matter. Every action matters. Every bit of warming we avoid matters. Every year matters. What we do matters. It makes a difference, and it builds a better future. So this is the last section. How do we get started? And this is your last chance. Go to PollEV, put your questions in there, look at the other questions people have entered, give a thumbs up to the ones that you like the most, and we're going to get to them in like 4 minutes. Here we go. How do we get started? Well, here's the thing. We think that most people are not worried because they don't want to talk about it and they're not really doing much. I'm the only one who's doing anything. Nobody else is, we think. Literally, there's a survey showing that. So if they're not worried, what do we have to do? We have to make them worried, right? But when we look at the data, that's not what the data says. The data shows that this is the situation. So we have this huge group of worried people, but we have this tiny group of activated people. So what's going to make worried people activated? Not more worry. More worry is actually going to paralyze them. Globally, around the world, a survey that came out last year showed that 80% of people want their country to do more, 78% their country should do more to protect people from extreme weather, and 72% of people around the world want their country to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy, and that number is higher in Canada. Yet, although we're worried about climate change, we feel helpless, hopeless, don't know what to do, and only 8% in the US are activated. These are US numbers, so 70% is about 80% in Canada, 50% is about 55% in Canada, and 8% isn't much difference. In fact, we are going in the wrong direction. Remember the 2023 wildfire season, how horrible it was? If most people weren't worried and we needed to get them worried to act, this would have worked. But I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that most people were already worried and that more worry overloads us, our defense mechanisms kick in, and we dissociate. So when the 2023 wildfire season happened, I made a prediction to myself. I predicted that Canadian levels of concern over climate change in the upcoming election would decrease. Why? Because I predicted people would feel even more helpless and hopeless at the scale of the wildfires, and then they'd be like, oh, well, if there's nothing I can do about it, I'll just vote on the price of housing. Well, guess what happened? Angus Reid poll, is environment a top issue facing Canada? What happened after the wildfires? It went down. Why? Not because people didn't think it was real. They knew what the orange skies look like. It was because they didn't know what to do. And that is why the equation for climate action does not stop and end with the head. The equation for climate action includes the head. What's happening? We need to know, yes. But then it moves on to the heart. Why does it matter? And science shows that health messages are some of the most effective messages at making that head to heart connection. But we can't stop at the heart. We need the hands. What can we do about it? Because otherwise we'll have a bunch of worried people who are paralyzed with fear. So the Yale program on climate change communication has developed a list of the 6 things people know. 10 years ago, it was 3 things. It's real, it's us, it's bad. But that's not enough. Since then, they've realized there's 3 more things people need to know. Experts agree, others care, and there is hope. These are the things we need to know. And if you don't have a lot of time, just go for the last 2. Around the world, most people are worried about climate change. In Canada, like I said, we're pushing 80%. but we're not talking about it. Look at that. Worried? Not talking about it. And so when I saw this data, I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing my TED Talk on. And I literally did. My TED Talk is literally on this to this. Because if we don't talk about, why do we care? And if we don't care, why would we do anything about it? So now if you go to my Instagram account, if you go to my Threads account, if you go to my Blue Sky account, if you go to my LinkedIn account, and not if you go to Facebook because they don't let you do this, you will see this pinned to the top. A science-based list of, if you're worried about climate change, what's the most important things you can do. Recycling is not on this list. Buying an EV is only implicit on this list. Eating more plants is implicit on this list. But the most important thing you can do is have a conversation about what? Head, heart, and hands. Join a climate action group to amplify that conversation. Speak with your money. Spark change at work and school with your voice. Hold politicians accountable. They need it every day. And take personal action to reduce your personal footprint. This is where the food and the EV and the travel and all that comes in, and make it contagious by talking about it. As Bill McKibben says, a very famous environmentalist in the US, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. That means rather than gazing myopically at our own carbon footprint, we need to look bigger and see how we can change the system to make the best choice for everybody, also the easiest and cheapest choice. Talking is so powerful. It changes who we see ourselves as. It changes what people around us think. It changes our ideas of what is or isn't normal. It changes our sense of, can we make a difference? Efficacy. And it changes our ability and willingness to act. Having conversations and breaking the climate silence is the missing link in climate action. Because if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? As Sarah Peach says, an environmental journalist, she says the goal is not to beat people up or to explain things to them. The goal is to bring them into the conversation and show them how they are already the perfect person to care. So if you want to talk about climate change, I have you covered. Because I did my TED Talk, I wrote my book, and then the number one question I would get from people is, what am I supposed to say? So I was like, okay, I will start a weekly newsletter. So I now have a weekly newsletter, and you can sign up via email on that little QR code there, or you can also sign up via Substack at, let me put this in here, HTTPS, talkingclimate.ca. Hopefully that works. I'm not sure. I never know with the wwws these days. If you just Google Talking Climate, you'll find it. Every single week, I share three things. I share good news about climate solutions. I share not so good news about how climate change is affecting our health or our food or the Olympics coming up. And then I share something we can do. Every single week, I give you three things that you can have conversations with people about. Why do I do this? I do this because what's at stake is so important that if we understood the scope of what's at stake, and if we understood how much better our future would be if we tackled this and patched the holes in our bucket, none of us would ever even be able to shut up about what the solutions look like and how each of us can play a role. Thank you. All right, I see that we have some questions already, and we have a bit of time to address those questions. So don't forget, you can still go there. You can still do some upvoting, but I'm going to take a look at those now. Okay, top question. The solutions sound very hopeful, but I struggle to see how we can implement or sustain them without first addressing the existing structures. Exactly, the hole in the bucket. I completely agree. This is why our voice is the most important thing we can do, using our voice. So, I could buy or not buy all the electric cars that I want. I could eat or not eat all the plants that I want. I could go live up in the Yukon off the grid and grow all my own food and have solar panels on the roof and compost myself when I died. And that wouldn't fix climate change. We have to change the system. I think about it this way. Think back to the abolition. Abolitionists boycotted cotton and they boycotted sugar. But how did they persuade the British Parliament to vote against slavery? By using their voices day in, day out for weeks, months, years, and decades until finally it happened. How did women get the vote? They got the vote by using their voices. How were civil rights enacted in the US? How did apartheid end in South Africa? Yes, we want to live true to our values, and we want to make sure that we are doing the most effective thing. And the most effective thing is changing the system so that the easiest choice for everyone and the most affordable choice for everyone to make when they are buying something or when they are traveling or when they're eating or whatever it is they're doing, the default choice, the big red easy button choice, is the best choice. And that can only be done within our systems, advocating for change at the hospital or the organization that we work for. Advocating for change, obviously, in the city where we are, or the school where our kids go to school. Advocating for change with politicians when they need to be accountable. And unfortunately, it's a little easier here than it is in the States because, man, in the States, it is hard. But that is the only way we're going to see change at the scale we need. Our voices are going to do it. And it's going to take a really long time and it's going to be hard, but we've already gotten started. That giant boulder of climate action, we often picture it as sitting at the bottom of a hill with like Greta Thunberg, she's this little girl, and Al Gore, he's been doing this for so many years, he must be exhausted. And Sir David Attenborough, like I mentioned, he's in his 90s. We picture these people trying to push the boulder and we're like, oh, well, it's not moving anyways, why should I help? But when you realize how many solutions are already being implemented around the world, and my newsletter every week shares this, we realize that giant boulder is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It's already got millions of hands on it. And if we add our hand, it will go a little bit faster. And if we use our voice to get more people to add their hands, it will go even faster. And so that is why the answer to climate change is system change. And how do we change the system? We change the system with our voices. Excellent question. All right, let us do a speed round now. See if I can get through others. Let's see, play from, here we go. Just a second here. My computer timed out for a second. All right. What do I think about politically linking the climate crisis with social justice? Well, the reason I'm a climate scientist myself personally is because it's a justice issue. I was planning to be an astronomer when I took a class on climate change, and I learned how profoundly unfair climate change is. And that's what made me become a climate scientist, is because the impacts are unjustly distributed, especially on those who did the least to cause the problem. However, when we're advocating for climate action, what do we need to start with? We need to start with whatever people already care about. So imagine if you had to instill a burning passion for social justice in everyone before they could take climate action. How's that going to work out? Not great. You know, I'll give you a better example. I like to ski, and you need snow to ski. So that is literally one of the reasons why I care about climate change. And there's a great organization called Protect Our Winters that's all about people who care about it for that reason. Do I think everybody has to become a skier to care about climate change? Obviously not. So in the same way, when we start to gatekeep, when we start to be like, oh, this is the door, the only door through which you can enter to climate action, we are actually just basically shooting ourselves in the foot. We're never going to make it. The reality is, no matter who somebody is, they already have the reasons they need to care. And our job is not to make them care for the same reasons we care. Our job is to figure out what reasons they already have. So I've had conversations where it turned out that they cared because they loved fishing, or they cared because they were a zero waste person, or they cared because they were a small business owner who would like to make a little more money by putting solar panels over his parking lot. The bottom line is we got to fix this thing, and we got to fix it with the people and the systems we have now. And by fixing it, we will be changing those systems. But we can't gatekeep and make everybody care for the same reasons we do. We have to figure out why they care. And I promise you, I have had tens of thousands of conversations with people, and I can count on my hands the number of people that I have not been able to find a reason for them to care with. And typically, they were people whose power and wealth depended on the current status quo in fossil fuels. So I totally understand how you're not going to find it with them, and I don't encourage those conversations. But with everybody else, if you keep at it, you can find it and you can help them make that connection. All right. Last couple of questions here. We are better at crafting messages than getting the message to the intended audience. Oh, thank you so much. I love that you said this. What's the strategy to reach the largest number, which is the middle? Yes. Don't go to like great Uncle Joe who keeps posting stuff on Facebook about how this is a hoax and Mars is warming. No, there's so many people who care and they don't know what to do. And the most effective ways to do it is to have conversations with them. Have conversations, because the most trusted people are people we know, and still scientists, thankfully, and healthcare professionals. So every way that we can have conversations, that's why I do social media, like I said. That's why I do my newsletter, Talking Climate. That's why I'm talking to you right now. Have a conversation about what? Remember, head, what's happening, heart, why it matters, and never forget the hands, what we can do about it. That is the way we can change things. Has how I talked about climate change changed with the shift in politics? I was a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration has canceled the National Climate Assessment. Most of my co-authors were federal employees, so they were not allowed to speak out under the first Trump administration. So I was one of the only authors who could actually get on social media and say, no, the White House press secretary said X, and that's not what the report says. On page 18, it literally says Y, or in some cases, not X. So in times like this in the US, I want to make sure that I'm speaking the truth, but it's getting more challenging, because I don't actually have any resources to do this. I have like a day job, and this is what I do extra. And so the resources that I was using to support my Talking Climate newsletter and the videos that I do were coming from my speaking honoraria. And in the US, a lot of people don't want to talk about climate change anymore. So I looked at the bank account a couple months ago and it was empty. So that's when I decided I was going to shut down. Just kidding. That's when I decided I was going to do twice as much. So now I've started 3 new video series with Talking Climate. One called Tea with Katharine, where I sort of share what's on my mind. One where I catch up with the guest editors of my newsletter. I've had some phenomenal guest editors and I interview them and we talk about what's new. And one where I respond to all the crazy comments I get on social media. So my Substack and my Patreon, you can subscribe to for the low price of, well, I was going to say the low price of $10 a month, but unfortunately that is American dollars, I'm sorry to say. And that's how I'm actually powering what I do, because I want to speak more about this, not less. And this is definitely the case in Canada as well. I want to keep talking about it because, frankly, even though the Liberal government is doing, in the past, has done more than the Conservative government would do, they still don't talk about it. They don't. And if you don't talk about it, why would anybody care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything about it? So we need to talk about it. We need to keep talking about it, and we need to encourage our politicians across the spectrum to keep talking. Well, this has been wonderful sharing this evening with you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Did you get all the resources that you need? This has been recorded, so you can, I think, right? You can share this with people. Feel free to share it. Feel free to go back and look at it. Again, you can find me on social media. I highly recommend subscribing to Talking Climate if you're interested. And if you'd like to support my outreach, just subscribe on Substack or Patreon. You get all the extra videos that way too, and you help me do what I do. Thank you.
I just want to end and thank you so much, Katharine. I feel invigorated and full of hope and full of wish to talk with everybody about this. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. This has been such a pleasure. Put one more link in the chat there. There we go. All right. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.